If you compare images of Akhenaten other depictions of pharaohs, you'll notice that Akhenaten looks very different.
For 3,000 years, nobody knew what this pharaoh looked like. Not really. Not truthfully. Egypt gave the world some of the most recognizable faces in human history. Tutankhamun's golden mask, the serene profile of Ramses, the calm authority carved into 100 temple walls. But one face was different. One face was hidden, hacked apart, buried under sand and silence on purpose. And when scientists finally coaxed that face back out of the darkness using nothing but bone and DNA, what they found didn't just solve a historical mystery. It exposed a secret the ancient priesthood had spent generations trying to erase. His name was Akhenaten, and somewhere around 1353 BCE, he inherited one of the richest, most stable thrones on earth, and then he set fire to almost everything it stood for. Egypt at that point had worshipped the same core pantheon for 2,000 years. Ammonius, chief among the gods, had temples stretching along the Nile, priesthoods with enormous wealth, and a religious machinery so entrenched it was basically inseparable from the government itself. Akhenaten's own father, Amenhotep III, had ruled through that machinery for decades, one of the most prosperous reigns Egypt ever saw. And then the son took the throne and, within a few years, did something almost unthinkable. He declared that only one god mattered, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun itself. Not a god represented by a falcon or a jackal or a human body with an animal's head, just the light, plain and undisguised, shining down on everyone equally. That alone would have been radical. But Akhenaten didn't stop at proclaiming a new god. He went after the old ones directly. He cut off funding to the temples of Ammonius, dismissed thousands of priests and workers who depended on those institutions, and ordered the name of Ammonius physically chiseled out of monuments across the kingdom, sometimes even when it appeared inside his own father's name. He changed his own name from Amenhotep, Ammonius is satisfied, to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. Then he abandoned the ancient capital altogether and built an entirely new city from nothing, out in the desert roughly halfway between Thebes and Memphis. He called it Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, and had boundary markers carved straight into the surrounding cliffs, inscriptions declaring that this ground belonged to his god forever and that he would never leave it. It rose astonishingly fast, a functioning capital with palaces, temples, and administrative quarters built in under a decade, using local mud brick rather than imported stone, almost as if speed mattered more than permanence. The city's temples were unlike anything Egypt had built before. Traditional temples were dim, enclosed spaces, deliberately dark, designed to hide the god's image from ordinary eyes. Akhenaten built his temples open to the sky, roofless courts where sunlight could fall directly onto altars piled with offerings. It was theologically consistent in its own way. If your god is the sun itself, you don't hide it in shadow, you let it in. But to Egyptians who had spent their entire lives inside a religious system built on secrecy and priestly mediation, it must have felt less like a shift in ritual and more like the ground giving way beneath them. And then there was his own image. This is the part that historians still argue about, because it's genuinely strange. Egyptian royal art had been governed by rigid conventions for 2,000 years. Kings were shown as idealized, athletic, ageless, youthful bodies meant to convey strength and divine perfection regardless of what the actual man looked like. Akhenaten threw that convention out entirely. The statues and reliefs commissioned during his reign show a figure with an elongated skull, a long thin face, heavy-lidded eyes, full lips, a slender neck, narrow shoulders, and then, jarringly, wide hips, a soft rounded belly, and what looks like breast tissue on an otherwise male body. Nothing like it exists anywhere else in 3,000 years of Egyptian art. And it wasn't confined to him. Nefertiti, his queen, and their daughters are shown with similar elongated skulls and unusual proportions, as though the family had agreed or been instructed to present themselves as visually distinct from every royal generation before them. For a long time, Egyptologists treated this as pure style, a kind of religious symbolism. Maybe the androgynous body was meant to represent the Aten's role as both mother and father to creation, the single source from which all life flowed. That's a reasonable interpretation, and plenty of respected scholars still hold it. But it never quite explained why the distortion was so specific, so anatomically consistent, or why it showed up across multiple family members rather than just the king. Other theories piled up over the decades. Marfan syndrome, a genetic condition that causes elongated limbs and a tall, thin frame. Froelich syndrome, associated with a pituitary disorder. Even simple artistic exaggeration meant to make an ordinary-looking king seem otherworldly and divine. None of them could be tested. There was no body confirmed to be Akhenaten's, no bones to examine, no way to check theory against physical reality. The debate just went in circles for 100 years, one generation of scholars passing the argument to the next. The reason there was no confirmed body comes down to what happened after Akhenaten died. His religious revolution didn't survive him. Within a few years of his death, the old priesthoods were restored, the capital at Akhetaten was abandoned, and later kings began systematically removing his name from the historical record. Temples were dismantled, and their stone blocks reused as filler inside other buildings. His name was omitted from later king lists entirely, as though the Amarna period, as historians now call it, had simply never happened. Somewhere in that campaign of erasure, a body ended up in Tomb KV55 in the Valley of the Kings, discovered in 1907. But it was in terrible shape. The gold face had been torn from the coffin, the identifying inscriptions had been deliberately hacked out, and the skeleton inside showed skeletal features that didn't cleanly match any single candidate. For over a century, researchers argued about whose body it actually was, Akhenaten himself, a lesser-known successor named Smenkhare, or someone else entirely. The breakthrough came in 2010, when a team led by Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, working with radiologists and geneticists, ran CT scans and DNA analysis on 11 royal mummies, including KV55, an unidentified woman known only as the Younger Lady, and Tutankhamun himself. The project took years of preparation, partly because ancient Egyptian DNA is notoriously hard to extract. Heat, humidity, and centuries of embalming chemicals all degrade genetic material. And partly because the team knew that if a single result got contaminated, critics would use it to dismiss the entire field of ancient DNA research for another decade. So they worked from dense bone and tooth samples, ran every extraction independently in duplicate labs, and cross-checked results under blind conditions before drawing any conclusions. What came back reshaped the family tree of Egypt's most famous dynasty. The genetic markers showed that KV55 and the Younger Lady were full siblings, not just related, but children of the same two parents. And Tutankhamun's DNA matched both of them as their biological son. In other words, Tutankhamun's parents were brother and sister. The team also found skeletal and genetic evidence tying KV55 closely to the artistic and physical traits associated with Akhenaten, and combined with contextual evidence from the tomb. Most researchers now accept that KV55 is, in fact, Akhenaten's body, making him Tutankhamun's father, married to his own sister. That single finding reframed the strange art from Amarna almost overnight. It wasn't necessarily symbolic exaggeration or pure religious metaphor. It may have been, at least in part, a family literally showing the physical consequences of generations of close-kin marriage. Sibling marriage wasn't unusual in Egypt's royal family. It had been practiced on and off for centuries, rooted in the belief that royal blood was semi-divine and needed to stay within the bloodline to preserve that sacred status. But biology doesn't care about theology. Every person carries a handful of recessive genetic mutations that do nothing as long as they're paired with a normal gene from the other parent. When two unrelated people have children, the odds of both parents carrying the same harmful recessive mutation are low. When siblings have children, they're drawing from an identical genetic pool, and that risk climbs dramatically. Repeat that pattern across multiple generations, as the Egyptian royal family did, and the odds of serious inherited conditions stop being a remote possibility and start becoming close to inevitable. Tutankhamun's own remains tell that story in painful detail. CT scans of his skeleton, conducted in the mid-2000s and refined in later studies, revealed a club foot, a congenital deformity that would have made walking without support genuinely difficult. One of his toe bones was missing from birth, not lost to injury. Researchers also identified signs of Koehler disease, a condition involving bone deterioration in the foot caused by disrupted blood supply, along with a mild curvature of the spine. His skull showed a slight cleft palate, and more than 100 walking sticks were found buried with him in his tomb, some plain, some elaborately decorated with gold and inlaid stone, several showing clear, where patterns consistent with regular use by a living person, not purely ceremonial objects placed there for the afterlife. On top of the skeletal issues, DNA testing found genetic traces of malaria in his tissue, multiple strains, suggesting repeated infection. He died around 19 years old, and while the exact cause is still debated, most researchers now see his death as the result of a body already weakened by inherited disease, finally overwhelmed by disease acquired in life. Once that genetic picture existed, reconstructing Akhenaten's actual face became possible in a way it never had been before. Using the skull recovered from KV-55, now widely, though not universally, accepted as Akhenaten's, forensic artists and anthropologists applied standard facial approximation techniques, the same methods used in modern forensic science to reconstruct faces from skeletal remains. They mapped tissue depth markers onto the skull, built up muscle and soft tissue according to established anatomical averages, and let the underlying bone structure do most of the work. What emerged was a long, narrow face with a jaw and cheekbone structure that closely echoed the exaggerated Amarna art, not identical to the extreme artistic style, but clearly related to it, as though the sculptors of Akhenaten had been working from a real, unusual face and pushing its features further for symbolic effect. That's really the heart of what this discovery does. It doesn't prove that every element of Amarna art was a literal medical portrait. Religious symbolism, artistic innovation, and physical reality were probably all tangled together in those images, and scholars will keep debating exactly how much weight to give each explanation. But it does something historians spent a century unable to do. It grounds the mystery in an actual human being instead of leaving it purely as a debate over style. For 3,000 years, the face on the temple walls was dismissed as exaggeration, propaganda, or myth. Then a small team in a sealed lab in Cairo spent years extracting fragments of degraded DNA from brittle, damaged bone, cross-checking every result against the risk of being wrong, and slowly assembled a family tree that no scribe in antiquity would ever have dared to write down. What they found wasn't a monster, and it wasn't a god. It was a family that believed its blood was too sacred to mix with anyone else's, generation after generation, until that belief quietly wrote itself into the bones of their own children. Akhenaten's strange, unforgettable face wasn't an artist's fantasy. It was a warning his descendants never got to read, and his son, propped up on 100 walking sticks, carried the weight of that warning until his body simply couldn't anymore. The priests who erased Akhenaten's name from history weren't just protecting old gods from a rebellious king. They may have been trying to bury the one truth Egypt's royal family could never afford to admit out loud, that the throne meant to be purified by sacred blood had instead been slowly, silently poisoned by it.